You're heading south of the Mason-Dixon. This is the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. Here is your host, Brian McClanahan.
Welcome back to the Week in Review at the Abbeville Institute. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this is episode 68, covering the week of April 17th through 21st, 2017. Glad to have you back on the program. Glad to be here. Before we get started, just a couple of things. If you do like this podcast, please consider making a tax-deductible contribution to the Abbeville Institute. We exist on your generous contributions alone. So if you like what we do, if you like how we explore what's true and valuable in the Southern tradition, you might want to help us out. We have all kinds of options to donate, from monthly options as little as $3 a month if you're a student, to yearly options to as little as $25 a month if you're a student. So if you're a non-student, you can donate as little as $5 a month, or $50 a year. $5 a month, that's less than a movie ticket a month or an expensive cup of coffee. You can help us keep this podcast going, keep the website going, help us fund our program. So if you do like this podcast, consider that. Also, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, like our YouTube page, and if you go to our webpage, abbevilleinstitute.org, you can sign up for our free email. So all you got to do is give us an email address, and we'll give you a free ebook, Kirkpatrick Sale's Emancipation Hell. So you might want to check that out too. And share our stuff around on social media. That's the only way we're going to keep the message going. So please do all those things. Please help us in every way you can. And it's not just for us, it's also for you. We are doing this as an educational opportunity for people to learn more about the South and the Southern tradition and what that means for America today. We explore all of those things, and we try to bridge the gap between the past and the present and the Southern tradition moving forward in American history. And speaking of that, our summer school, the 15th annual summer school this year, July 9th through July 14th at Seabrook Island, South Carolina. The title is On Being Southern in an Age of Radicalism, and it will feature a number of great speakers, including yours truly. Also, we have a distinguished guest lecturer, James Livingston, Major General James Livingston, who is a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. He will be speaking at our supper on Wednesday that week. So we got a lot of great stuff going on, and we'd like you to be a part of it. Now, that said, this week was also really great at the Abbeville Institute. We had a lot of great material that was published, and several of the pieces came from an old edition of Southern Partisan Magazine. And in the 80s, Southern Partisan Magazine was just a fantastic publication, and unfortunately, that changed over time. But in the 80s, it was really quite good, and we ran a few pieces out of that particular magazine this week. So the first is actually by a author named William Gill, and the title of the piece is The Soul of the Southern Tradition. And that's kind of the theme for the week. What is the Southern tradition? What is the intellectual Southern tradition? And we tried to really get to the heart of that this week. And this piece does a pretty good job with that. You know, William Gill admits he was born in the North, and actually that's when you look at our summer school. One of the things that the advertisement specifies is that you don't have to be from a specific race or ethnic group, or you don't have to have a certain ideology to be Southern. And that's what Gill is saying. You know, what is this thing? What is the true soul of the Southern tradition? He says essentially it's Western civilization, and it began back in Greece. A lot of people don't realize this, but Southerners, particularly people like Basil Gildersleeve, were great classicists. They understood what was at stake in preserving this society that they lived in, and not just that, the principles of the original founding. There's been a couple of really good books written about the influence of the classics on the founding generation, and by a guy named Carl Richard. And he points out that, look, all of these men, even in the North at the time, were educated on a classical tradition. They were classically educated. So they learned from the Greeks and the Romans. They could read Latin. They could read Greek. And they studied Greek philosophy in the original form. They read Roman histories in the Latin that they were written in. And so that classical education, of course, they were heavily influenced by Christianity, and that part of Western civilization made them what they were. Gildersleeve often pointed out that that war was the American Iliad, and a lot of people have done that since and say, this is or it was the American version of the Peloponnesian War. It was Sparta against Athens, and I think that when we look at the South in that particular way, that it was extending the tradition of Western civilization, it becomes different. And he says, did this tradition die at Appomattox? And he said, no, I don't think it did. It did thin out, he quote, the real blood of America. But people like Lee were an extension of the West, of this great Western civilization, the soul of the Southern tradition. And he says it's in decline. This is written in 1983. He said the Western tradition, or the Southern tradition as well by default, is in decline. But it's still there if there is a remnant of the population that believes in it. And I think that's one thing that hits to the heart of the Institute. We're not just talking about the Southern tradition, because by default the Southern tradition is, I say over and over again, the American tradition, and then that American tradition is the Western tradition. That idea of republicanism, which goes back to Rome and Greece, and also the English political and social traditions that stretch back well over 1,000 years. That is what the South was fighting for. The principle of local self-government and self-determination. If nothing else, to reduce the war and what was going on there to something else. The idea that these men would charge entrenched positions for anything less is really preposterous. They were fighting for their self-determination, for the ability to govern themselves. And I think that has long been the American tradition. You look at the American War for Independence, it was a war for them to govern themselves, to be free from an imperial power that was abusing its constituted authority. The American War for Independence was as much a constitutional struggle as the Southern War for Independence. What was the nature of government from the center? And could people decide that they had had enough, or even if the threat that they saw, was that enough to say we want our independence? That had been the American tradition. Now, part of this he also says, quote, in the end, this belief that the Southern tradition is worth fighting for must prevail over materialism, which murders all things of the spirit. And so that materialism, which has become, in so many ways, part of the American tradition, we're only happy if we're buying stuff. We're only happy if we can spend money. And that's not the Southern tradition, as we're going to get into with the piece on Thursday, and also actually very much every piece this week gets into that. This belief in materialism is not the South. It's something deeper than that. It's an attachment to place. It's an attachment to people. And so, if we think about the South in that way, an attachment to people in place, to localism, then the Southern tradition becomes deeper than just some, hypothetical defense of rights or a constitution. It's about your next door neighbor, your family. On my own podcast, I often talk about the phrase "think locally, act locally," and I think that's That's what Southerners were doing. And for so many years they've been doing that. Now, most Americans did that up until the war, and then everyone started looking at the center to make decisions for them. And I think that's something that's we've come to expect in America. Some problem arises, and we think that the center is going to take care of it. We want the superhero flying in and solving the problem rather than the people in the community themselves. And so the Southern tradition was about sweeping your own back porch and minding your own business in many ways. Taking care of your family first, taking care of your local community first, and then you're worried about the state, and then the center. And that idea of constituted authority, that the center only had certain powers, that was born out of localism. Local self-government. That's it. It's that tradition of that made that idea of federalism work. This is what Jefferson, his political philosophy of federalism, which dominated his ideas. He was a reformer, without doubt. He was a reformer in Virginia on many things, including education, on religion. He was a reformer, but his gaze stopped at his mountains. He didn't want to reform New England because he thought they were beyond reform. He really didn't want to reform South Carolina or Pennsylvania or New York, but he didn't mind reforming Virginia. And so this belief in federalism that, again, Virginians should mind their own business in their own backyard was extended to every type of reform idea. Now, he did believe that the center had certain constituted authority, and as president, he pursued those goals. There were things that a union could do to benefit the states, but not when it came to things that were exclusively local. And so that is, again, that idea of federalism is very much part of the Southern tradition, but it had to come back to something tangible, something real. It's not an ideology. It was about people in place. And people today talk about, decentralization. We want to have, the secession of California or the secession of Vermont or the secession of Oklahoma or Texas. One thing that has to be made clear, you can't do that unless you have a culture to defend. And it can't be materialism. It has to be something else. Political independence can only happen if you have an independent people with a culture worth defending. And maybe California has that. Maybe Vermont has that. I think one thing that was interesting about the Vermont independence movement when Thomas Naylor was running it was that they were really focused on Vermont culture and ensuring that type of culture was maintained. It wasn't just a political culture. They were interested in that. But it was also a culture of people. And it was a leftist culture, but it was a culture they thought was worth defending. And you have to have that first. It can't just be, I don't want to pay taxes, so we're going to talk about seceding. Because you know what? The central authority that's created after you secede is going to collect your taxes. It has to be about defending something else. And this is why people talk about culture. Sometimes the mainstream Republicans like to forget that culture exists, that there's something deeper than just we don't want to pay taxes and we want to have good corporations. That doesn't create a culture. You have to have something worth hanging on to. As Gill says, there have to be things worth fighting for, a sense of honor, a belief in the transcendence of the spirit. In other words, Christianity. Now that said, the piece that we ran on Tuesday was it was some remarks by a man named JCC Black in 1886, and this little excerpt came from Bernard Thursum's circa 1865, but it's a speech that was given at the unveiling of a statue to Benjamin H. Hill in Atlanta, Georgia. And this particular speech is interesting because he gets into, the title of the speech is The South and Her People. So again, what was the South defending in 1861? And he begins by saying, look, the Southern Confederacy contemplated no invasion or conquest. Its chief cornerstone was not African slavery. Its foundations were laid in the doctrines of the fathers of the Republic, and the chief cornerstone was the essential fundamental principle of free government, that all governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. Again, the Western tradition, local self-government. And the purity of their motives, he said, and the loftiness of their patriotism, and their love of liberty, they who declared and maintained the first were not worthier than those who declared and failed in the last. And he's talking about the difference between the founding generation and the Southern people. And then he says, what was the South and who were her people? Where do you look for in the civilization of a people? In their history, in their achievements, in their institutions, in their character, in their men and women, in their love of liberty and country, in their fear of God, in their contributions to the progress of society. Measured by this high standard, where was there a grander and nobler civilization than hers? And this is an important statement in 1886, because in 1886, we're only 21 years removed from the war. But we had gone through Reconstruction, at least the official version of Reconstruction, but Reconstruction was ongoing in the South. Things were changing in the South. And it's often thought, and this is when we go to the summer school, I'm going to speak on the New South. It's often thought that the New South, in some ways, was devoid of any intellectual activity. It was, as Mencken said, this desert. But this is simply not true. And not just that, Southerners were keenly aware that they were the other of American society. And they were conscious of the fact that they had to defend who they were as a people. And he talks about what Southern men and women were. And he says, whose young men were more chivalric, whose young women more chaste, whose fathers and mothers worthier examples, whose homes more abounded in hospitality, as genial and free to every friendly comer as the sun that covered them with its splendor. Was there more respect for women, for church, for the Sabbath, for God, and for the law, which next to God is entitled to the highest respect and veneration of man, for it is the fittest representative of his awful majesty and power and goodness? Was there more love of home, of country, and of liberty? These are important questions. This is what the South was hanging on to. This is what they were defending. Again, it's a culture they're defending, not some abstract political principle in a way. I mean, the idea that you're fighting for local self-determination, but you had to be defending the people too. He says, her women adorned the highest social circles of Europe and America with their modesty, beauty, and culture. Her men in every society won a higher title than the grand old name of gentlemen, that of Southern gentlemen. And then he says, what has the South added to the glories of the Republic? He brings up Jefferson, Washington, Madison, Marshall. He says, it is asked where the South history was written. He says, it was written upon the brightest page of American annals. It was written upon the records of the convention that made the Constitution. It was written in the debates of Congresses that met not to wrangle over questions of mere party supremacy, but like statesmen and philosophers to discuss and solve great problems of human government. Forced to defend our homes and liberties after every honorable effort for peaceful separation, we went to war. Our leaders were worthy in their high commission. Our people sealed their sincerity with the richest treasure ever offered, and the noblest holocaust ever consumed upon the altar of country. And he concludes by saying this, to many of you who enjoy the honor of having participated in it, the history is known. You ought to prove yourselves worthy of that honor by teaching that history to those who come after you. And it's not just about the history of the war. It's about the history of the people. On Wednesday, we ran a piece by Clyde Wilson entitled The Mind of the Old South, and this is a review of a book entitled All Clever Men Who Make Their Own Way, Critical Discourse in the Old South. It was edited with an introduction by the British historian Michael O'Brien, and was published actually in 1982. But Clyde says, look, the intellectual history of the South is yet to be written. And he criticizes people that say that, look, there was no Southern intellectual history between Jefferson and Faulkner. This doesn't even make any sense. And the question is, were there in the Old South men and women who were intelligent, widely read, and traveled, interested in and abreast of the world, of ideas, past and current, and capable of formulating their thoughts creatively and communicably? Did the Old South, in other words, exhibit an intellectual culture in the best sense of that term, rather than merely journalists and orators concerned with an apologia for their vested interest? And he said, yes, of course they did. And he says, the more one understands the components of the literary achievements of figures like Faulkner and the agrarians, the more apparent it becomes to the reasonably perceptive that such criterion must rest upon historical roots, must have literary forebears. And he says this book is helping uncover that there were intellectual people in the Old South. And I think also there were intellectual people in the New South as well. But that's part of this Southern intellectual tradition. And he brings up two very important people. I've already mentioned Basil Gildersleeve, but also Louisa McCord. Very skilled poet, dramatist. And so, a great writer. But this particular idea that there was nothing in the South, that the South was even devoid of intellectual activity other than Jefferson in the Old South, I mean, in the earliest South, I mean, it's silly. There were great writers in the South, great philosophers, great political thinkers. And he says, but most people say, well, they were just orators, people like John Randolph of Roanoke. They're just speakers. They weren't great intellects. Well, there was no literary people in the South. And even some Southerners picked up on this and say, well, I mean, they're kind of right. The South really didn't lend to intellectual activity. It was more interested in martial arts and the science of agriculture. But I mean, I would put up, John Taylor of Caroline as a philosopher against anyone that the North produced at the time, against anyone. He thoroughly trounces Joseph Story in his ruminations on the Constitution, and so did Abel Upshur, who directly attacked Story. But St. George Tucker, the Tuckers in general, great thinkers. And then, of course, you had literary figures in the South, Edgar Allan Poe and William Gilmore Simms. And we've talked about a number of important people, scientists like Murray, the scientist of the seas. I mean, these people were produced in the South. So I think that when you think about the Southern tradition, people don't think about the intellectual life of the Old South, but it was there. And also it was there in the New South. In some ways, it mirrored Rome in the writing of history. Southerners were very good at writing history. Very good at it. And, Lyon Tyler, who was John Tyler's son, was a very good historian at the College of William and Mary. And he drove people batty with things that he would say because he was very much pro-South. But it wasn't just that. But Southerners wrote very good histories in the postbellum period. There was also great Southern writers. So Madame Levert from Mobile, Alabama, was a great Southern intellect, a great representative of the Southern people all over the world. So I think that one thing we've lost is this understanding of who Southerners were as a people. And that's because, of course, they've allowed Northerners to write the history of the South. This idea of Southern studies programs, I mean, again, as we've said on this podcast and in several articles on the Abbeville Institute, we should have Northern studies programs because they were the odd in the 19th century. It was the North that was odd, not the South. One thing I haven't mentioned on this particular podcast in the last couple of weeks is that we are right here at our 3-year anniversary of the website, and we've been doing this podcast over a year now. And when I say we've got articles on these things on the website, we've got over 1,000 articles on the website now. 1,000 articles on Southern culture, history, philosophy. There's so much there. It's really a treasure trove. And so if you're not going to our website on a regular basis, if you're listening to this podcast, I would assume you are. But if you're not, you need to get over there and read these things. There's so much material there. Now, on Thursday, we ran a wonderful piece by Andrew Nelson Lytle entitled Reflections of a Ghost. And he gets into this idea of what was the Southern tradition and who was he at the time. And he says, he talks about farming, and this is the idea that there has to be something tangible about the South, something worth defending. And he says, the communities were the shape of society in the South. Even after the First World War, he says, I was there. I lived in them. Most of the towns in the South, and cities too, lived by the country. And he says this, my argument in 2 essays was this, the small farm upholds the state. I didn't give a number of acres. What I meant was a family-owned and operated place. If the place has no mortgage, you live in a dwelling house without paying money for rent. If you plow with a team, you grow your own fuel. You grow most of your food. You do grow crops for money, but you are not completely in the money economy. You live at home with security. And you are a part of a living community with other families in your situation, some better to do than others, as will always be the case. And so that's important. It gives you a sense of place. It grounds you somewhere. One thing I did see, that there are people now that are thinking more and more about staying put in a place than moving around all the time. For years, the idea was you get a promotion, you move. You move around. You don't stay in one place. You don't create a homestead, in other words. But now people are talking about, this is my home. This is where I'm going to be. And it's not just in the South. I mean, this is taking place in parts across the country. And if you look at, there was a really interesting map that came out after the 2016 election, and the amount of area that Trump won and Clinton won. Very small pockets in urban areas, essentially, is where Clinton called her greatest political victories. That's where she won her districts. And then Trump won everything else. Most of the territory of the United States where people live, real people, was Trump territory. That's because there's a sense of place there. And they're not looking for the center to do anything for them. They can do it themselves. That's the idea. He tells a really interesting story at the end of this particular piece about traveling around, even in the North, and what it was like to do this in the early 20th century, 1928. He says, through Maryland into Virginia, we camped by the side of the road or in a farmer's lot and picked his turnip greens and cooked them in a pot with sow belly. I knew how to make a hoe cake. The water and greens were free, as was the campground. If we felt we could afford it, we would stop in a village or some courthouse with buildings about it and eat a lunch for 35 cents. If it was 45, we might drive on. There was only one tourist camp the entire way, no buildings, but a common washroom and commodes. This was outside Richmond. We pitched our pump tents there. Sometimes we washed and dressed and went into a town on invitation, which was always welcome as a change of diet. He talks about when he was traveling through Mississippi. He continued his trip. He says, later I went on alone to Mississippi, where Forrest often rode. I can't believe it had changed much from war days. Going through the back country to Tupelo, I stopped to inquire the way. Teams were hitched about the courthouse fence. A political meeting was afoot. The patriarchs, all in black hats and white beards, sat on the platform with their hands on hickory sticks. It was obvious that little of folly would take place in their presence. I was asked to take out and join the crowd. I was not asked to park my Ford. I thanked the man, but told him I was running late. Could he direct me to Tupelo? I was told to go down the road, and he pointed which way until I come to a widow woman's house, where I was to turn left. I thanked him and went on. I had no trouble finding the widow woman's house. It had no stove wood stacked in the yard. And he says at the end, I've often asked myself, why was it that so few people listened to us in 1930 when they wrote I'll Take My Stand? Although most were sympathetic, the kind of life they knew was at stake. I think the reason of their seeming indifference is this. Nobody could imagine the world they were born in, had lived in, and were still living in could disappear. He says, well, it has. This piece was written in the early 80s as well. Well, it has. No one can imagine the Southern tradition going away. Well, it's going away. No one could imagine 30 years ago the attacks on the South that are taking place today. Well, they are. And he says, as my final word, I think we should have found a larger word than agrarian, for it was this whole country's Christian inheritance that was threatened, and still is. And so there we have it again, the attachment to Western civilization to the South, a way of life, a people. You have to have a culture to have a people. And in order for any type of political independence, you have to have a culture. If you don't have that, if it's simply materialism, you're lost. And so that actually nicely bridges into the final piece of the week by Harry Hope, The Search for Life After Pac-Man. Again, this was written in the early 80s, and so Harry Hope talks about moving out to the country. And he says, lately I've been rereading the agrarian writers who made their mark 50 years ago. Nobody I've met in Clouds Creek has ever heard of, much less read, the agrarian philosophers of Vanderbilt and I'll Take My Stand. He says they don't need to, because as agrarian values are explained, these people invariably respond, hell, I don't see what the big fuss is all about. These are things we've been doing or thinking or believing for years now. So there it is. Lytle's saying that's disappearing, but here's Hope at 32 saying, I'm moving out to the country, and this is exactly what I'm finding. It still exists. But, it can disappear. He says, sure, there are wonderful things outside the borders of Saluda County, South Carolina. The Parthenon, the Vatican, the Louvre. Johann Sebastian Bach praised the Lord with magnificent, joyful noises, and Ludwig von Beethoven raged at him. A Serbian nationalist shot an Austrian archduke, and Western civilization came to an end 4 years later. This kind of thing happens today. Somewhere in New York or Washington, D.C., there may even be somebody doing something important and lasting this very moment. We just haven't been told, that's all. But he says the real problem is that we're not being taught what American tradition was, and by extension, the Southern tradition. He says, you can see that some of the messier presentations of the 1980s South have slipped into God's country. Look at what happened to country music when the New York, Los Angeles crowd discovered there was money in it. Now some of the country radio stations are beginning to program Bob Seger cuts. And I don't know what's going to happen when the little country store up the road installs the inevitable Pac-Man. with all those kids running in from the countryside to dump quarters into a machine that sounds like a Wurlitzer organ with indigestion. It may mean the end of the fine old institution, the Southern beer joint. These insidious outside forces got to our food a long time ago, and we should have realized what was going on when somebody started putting sugar in the cornbread. Now, Ronald McDonald is all over the place. Its golden arches constitute the tallest structure in one town that I know. In Tennessee, Ernie Ford is on the TV selling Martha White pizza crust mix. He said the whole attitude was neatly summed up a few years ago by the multi-talented Dolly Parton in explaining her wardrobe and accessories. She said, "We was all raised poor, and we didn't have much except our music. Then when we started getting attention and making a little money, we all just went overboard." He says, and this all leaves me with his one final question, the big one. Will my 3 prospective stepchildren and the other Southern children of their generation know who they are, where they come from? If indeed children are our greatest natural resource, will they all know that there is life after Pac-Man? And that's a good question. That's why we're doing what we're doing now. In fact, that sums up the mission of the Abbeville Institute quite well. Will anyone know there's life after Pac-Man? Nowadays, it's life after a series of materialist things. But if we don't know that, if we don't push this thing, if we don't find there's something worth fighting for, all of the things, because it's not just the South we're fighting for Western civilization. We're fighting for a people and a place, for the preservation of a way of life, the agrarian way of life. And you don't have to be an agrarian. You don't have to actually live on a farm to enjoy and appreciate that particular type of tradition and what that brings to America. I mean, of course, you would want to have those things. You would want to have independent farmers. What you really want to have, though, are independent people. Independent people with a culture and a backyard worth fighting for. And it's not just how much money you pay into the federal treasury. It's the values that you have, the principles. Those are the things worth fighting for. And so I hope if you go back and look at the articles this week, that's what you get out of it. There is something there, something tangible in the South, still to this day, that's worth fighting for. Until next time, good day.